They showed up with blistered feet, no family, no money, just a broken tool bag and a secret their father said made them monsters. The winter wind cut like glass across the empty stretch of Prairie Bend, where nothing moved except snowflakes and silent prayers. Willer Langford stood ankle-deep in ash, the remains of her barn still warm from the fire 2 nights before. Her breath clouded in the frigid air as she stared out across the desolate field. Her husband had been gone for nearly a year now. The insurance money was delayed, the land was dying, and the bank letters came more often than visitors. Pride had kept her on this soil, but pride didn't fix fences or milk cows or pay debts. So when she saw 2 figures through the haze stumbling, slow, too thin for boys that age, she didn't blink. She thought they were ghosts, but they stopped at her fence. Julian Frost stood barely upright, his lips cracked from cold, his hair stiff with frost. Beside him, Caleb Frost looked worse, shoulders squared like he was ready to take a punch, but knees buckling under weight he didn't speak about. Identical in height and frame, but something in their eyes told 2 stories. Julian looked at the earth. Caleb looked straight at her. They said they could fix things, anything. Mend the barn, clean the troughs, pull weeds by hand if needed. They had no expectations, just a warm place to sleep and whatever food was going spare. Julian offered a half smile, trembling as he held out the dented toolbox, the handle wrapped in cloth. One hinge broken, but clean. "We don't need much," he said softly. "Just a chance." Willer narrowed her eyes. The boys looked ragged, clothes torn, fingertips raw. They weren't high, weren't loud, weren't stealing. They just stood there together. She thought about saying no. She thought about what the town might say, a widow letting 2 strangers onto her land. But then she noticed something. Caleb's body was always angled just enough to shield his brother. Every time Julian swayed, Caleb's hand would subtly move behind his back, not touching, just there, ready. The way someone moves when they've spent years catching a person before they hit the floor. Willer sighed and motioned them in. Inside the kitchen, the stove gave off a weak heat. She poured warm broth into chipped mugs. The boys didn't ask for more. They didn't complain. They ate like people who hadn't had dinner yesterday or the day before. She asked where they came from. Julian paused. "We're not welcome back," he replied. That was it. No anger, no blame, just a quiet acceptance, like he'd been rehearsing the line for months and finally let it go. They didn't mention a home, or parents, or how long they'd been walking. But Willer saw the red around Caleb's knuckles and the hole in Julian's boot and figured whatever had happened, it hadn't been fair. That night, she set them up in the old tool shed behind the house. There was a cot, a quilt, and a heater that buzzed like an angry fly, but it was dry and safe. Before shutting the door, she handed them a second blanket and said, "We start early." Julian nodded with a quiet, "Yes, ma'am." Caleb just held the blanket like it was something sacred. She went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, thinking about the look in Julian's eyes. Not fear, not gratitude, something else. Shame. But not the kind you carry for what you've done, but the kind people stuff down your throat until you believe it was always yours to bear. In the morning, the frost hadn't lifted, but the boys were already working, Caleb hauling burnt wood into piles, Julian sweeping the path between the barn and the house like he'd lived there all his life. Willer watched from the window. She didn't know their story yet. But she knew boys who showed up in a snowstorm with nothing and still said thank you after a bowl of broth were not the kind to burn down their own chances. And for the first time since her husband died, she left the front door open. Love doesn't always arrive in perfect packaging. Sometimes it comes with cracked boots and bruised hands, asking for a second chance at warmth. And if you're lucky, you recognize it before it walks away. For more stories that prove love never needs permission to exist, follow Heart Story, where every tale dares to love out loud. The days that followed moved with the rhythm of calloused hands in quiet gratitude. Julian scrubbed the well pump until it shone beneath the winter sun, fixing the broken valve using only what was left in their dented tool bag. Caleb pulled weeds from the frozen ground behind the barn, each motion careful, methodical as if every inch of Willer's soil deserved its own kind of reverence. They never needed instruction. Willer would mention something once in putting a stubborn hinge, a rotten beam, and by evening, it was mended. They moved as if trying to repay a debt they couldn't name. Julian took notes in a pocket journal each night. Caleb checked the perimeter fencing every morning before sunrise. Inside the house, Willer pretended not to notice how Julian hesitated before touching anything breakable. How Caleb always stood between his brother and the window. They were like wild animals learning how to trust a room. Or maybe they just knew too well how rooms could turn. To Willer, they were boys trying to rebuild. To the town, they were a problem waiting to happen. The whispers began at the post office. Where did they come from? Don't look like regular farmhands. One woman clutched her coat tighter and murmured, "Heard they've got no parents." Some say they were thrown out. By the second week, the local diner was alive with speculation. I saw them walking back to the Langford place after dark. Both of them. Too close. She took them in, Lord have mercy. Poor woman must be desperate. Some weren't subtle. While Julian unloaded feed one morning, two boys from the lumber yard rode by on bikes and yelled out, "How's your boyfriend?" Huh. Julian didn't flinch. He just kept stacking the bags. Back straight, shoulders squared. But Caleb saw. That night, while patching the chicken coop, Willer found him hammering nails with too much force. The board shook. His jaw clenched. He didn't say anything. He never did, but the rage burned beneath the surface. Later, as they shared stew in the kitchen, Willer asked gently, "People been saying things I don't care about, but I need to know if you're safe here, if someone's after you." Caleb said nothing, and Julian stared at his spoon for a long while, then whispered, "I came out." Silence. Oh, Julian's voice cracked when he added, "And Caleb didn't let them hit me." That was the whole story. No details, no names, no grand confessions, but it was enough. Willer looked at the two boys across the table, one carrying a bruise that no one saw, the other carrying the burden of having stood between love and hate. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. Tired of a world that treated kindness like currency and queerness like crime. She reached for her cup, steadying her hands. They had given her no reason to doubt them, but the world outside didn't need a reason. Suspicion was enough. Whispers could do what fists didn't have to. The next morning, Julian was back at the orchard with pruning shears, talking softly to the trees as he worked. Caleb oiled the hinges of the front gate. Neither of them asked for anything. Willer stood on the porch, her arms crossed, watching the town's rumors swirl like dust in the wind loud, useless, and always clinging to the wrong things. And still the boys worked, not to be accepted, but because working gave them something to hold on to. In a town like Prairie Bend, it didn't take much to be labeled. A look, a rumor, a silence too long. But Willer knew what most people never tried to learn. You can't measure someone's worth by what others fear in them. You measure it by what they choose to carry and who they carry it for. And those boys, they carried each other. That was worth more than any good opinion this town had left to give. The storm didn't come with thunder. It came in the form of a sheriff's knock. It was early morning when Willer opened the front door and saw Deputy Briggs standing there, boots heavy with frost, holding a small evidence bag in gloved hands. Inside it, a delicate gold locket, the kind passed from mother to daughter. Familiar. "We found this in one of the boys' belongings," he said flatly. "It belongs to Mrs. Henderson. She reported it missing last night." Willer's face hardened. Which boy, Caleb? The air between them turned sharp. Briggs didn't accuse. He didn't need to. The implication hung heavy in his silence. That same silence trailed him when he walked back to his patrol car, leaving the bag behind like a sentence yet to be carried out. Willer stood still, her hand wrapped around the doorknob long after he left. In the tool shed, Caleb sat on the cot, staring at his boots. Julian stood beside him, pacing with short, tight steps. Neither looked up when Willer entered. "We'll go," Caleb said, without waiting for her to speak. His voice was flat, without protest or explanation. Willer looked at him. "You didn't do it." Caleb shrugged. "Doesn't matter." Julian stepped forward. "Someone planted it. You know that, right? We didn't steal anything." "We wouldn't." His voice cracked on that last word, wouldn't, like it was more than a denial. Like it was a plea not to be seen as every stereotype the town already whispered about them. Willer didn't respond. She sat on the crate beside the window and stared at the horizon. The barn, the orchard, the frost curling along the fence posts, all of it quiet, all of it unchanged. But inside the town, something had shifted. She could feel it, the way you feel a splinter before it surfaces. A choice had been made, and it wasn't theirs. At the general store later that day, the clerk didn't say hello. An old man on the porch shook his head. Willer overheard a woman mutter near the flour sacks. "I told you, 2 boys, no parents." Something wasn't right from the start, and then, as if to close the case, she added, "No decent family throws out good sons." Willer clenched her jaw, because they believed it, not the theft, but the narrative behind it. That being cast out was proof that boys like Julian and Caleb were only ever trouble, waiting for their moment. Later that afternoon, she asked the boys to sit with her in the kitchen. "I want to know exactly what happened," she said. Caleb stared at the tabletop. Julian spoke first. "Nothing happened. We've barely left the farm except to get feed. We don't even know where Mrs. Henderson lives." Willer didn't doubt the men, but facts were flimsy things in a place that thrived on suspicion. "What are you going to do?" Julian asked softly. Caleb didn't ask. He just waited for the verdict. Willer met their eyes. "I'm not doing anything." Julian exhaled, barely a breath. "But people talk," she continued. "And they'll keep talking, no matter what the truth is." Caleb nodded, not in agreement, but resignation. That's how it always goes. He didn't say where always had happened before, but the line in his voice made it clear this wasn't the first town. Not the first accusation. Not the first time they were judged for what they were. Not what they'd done. "We'll leave tomorrow," he added. "No need for you to get involved." But that's what made Willer pause. "No," she said. "If you leave, they win. And they get to say boys like you never belonged in the first place." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was protective, as if a quiet wall had just been built around the kitchen table. Outside, the snow fell in slow spirals. Inside, 3 people sat in stillness, one with regret, one with fear, and one with resolve. And somewhere in a place where truth had no microphone and decency got buried under assumptions, someone had decided that a locket was enough to define 2 lives. But Willer knew better. Because sometimes the lie isn't in the accusation, it's in what people are too afraid to believe. That 2 boys could be different, kind, and brave and still worth defending. And the cruelest labels are often the ones that sound like they make sense. Willer had never spoken into a microphone in her life. But that night, she stood beneath the flickering lights of the Prairie Bend Town Hall, her hands steady as they gripped the old wooden podium. The room smelled faintly of mildew and self-righteousness, the same mix that had lingered since her husband's funeral, when folks had shown up with casseroles and expectations. But none stayed long enough to help repair the roof when the storm came. Now they were here again. Not for her, but to watch, to judge, to tear down 2 boys who hadn't asked for anything but work, food, and quiet. She looked out across the folding chairs lined with crossed arms and tight lips. Cornelius Thorne sat dead center, his suit too sharp for a farming town, eyes already narrowed like a man preparing to strike. Willer cleared her throat. "Some of you have known me a long time," she began. "You knew my husband. You bought our apples. You waved when you passed our truck. You called us the Langfords like it meant something." A pause. Then my barn burned. Then my bills piled. and none of you came around. She let that sit. But now that I've got 2 boys on my land, fixing what none of you helped fix, you're suddenly interested. A rustle in the crowd, a cough, the kind of discomfort that reveals the nerve she'd just touched. I took in Julian and Caleb Frost because they showed up in the snow, bruised and hungry, and asked to work for soup. They didn't lie. They didn't steal. They showed me more integrity in 2 weeks than this town's shown me in 2 years. She could feel the tension rise. She didn't flinch. I know about the locket, and I know it didn't just land in their toolbox by accident. A few heads turned, eyes darted toward Thorne, who remained still. I also know, she said, voice sharper now, that Cornelius Thorne was seen visiting Mrs. Henderson the night before the locket went missing. Gasps. A whisper swept the room. From the corner, Henley stood. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, I saw him. The doctor said simply, he was there, and I've lived here long enough to know when someone's playing a dirty hand. Cornelius rose. This is slander. This is truth. Willer cut in. A beat of silence followed. Then she spoke softer. You don't have to like them. You don't have to understand them. But if you hate them for loving each other, for protecting each other, then hate me too. Because I've seen what they've carried. And you don't get to label that kind of strength as deviance. Julian sat in the back, frozen, pale, eyes wide. Caleb's hands were clenched in his lap, but his jaw was steady. Willer continued, you call yourselves good people, church-going, neighborly. But where were your prayers when 2 teenagers were thrown out for being who they are? Where was your kindness when they walked through the snow with nowhere to go? You talk about family like it's blood, but family is the hand that reaches for you when you're falling. And if that makes them brothers, then yes, that love saved them. And it might have saved me, too. No one moved, not at first, but slowly. A few people lowered their eyes, some shifted in their seats. The silence wasn't agreement, but it was a step away from hatred. Julian wiped his cheek with the sleeve of his jacket. Caleb didn't cry. He never did. But his hand found his brother's under the bench. The meeting ended without applause, without decisions, but also without arrests. Outside, the air felt different. Not warm, but not cruel. Willer walked past Cornelius without a glance, past the judgment, past the shame they tried to place on her shoulders. She had chosen her side. And she wasn't going to apologize for it, because when a community lets suspicion speak louder than humanity, it's not just the accused who suffer. It's everyone who forgets what it means to stand up when it's inconvenient. And sometimes the loudest act of courage isn't a fight. It's saying, I see them, and not looking away. Autumn came softer that year. Prairie Bend, after months of tension, breathed a little easier. The frost didn't bite as hard. The trees turned gold without hurry. And the town, the same one that once whispered behind closed doors, now watched in quiet reflection as 2 young men turned a struggling farm into something living again. 6 months had passed since that night in the town hall. The orchard behind Willer's house bore fruit again, not just apples, but peach saplings, vines, and herbs Julian had coaxed from barren ground. Each morning, he walked between the rows with a small notebook, scribbling observations in neat cursive, whispering to the plants like they understood. Maybe they did. Inside the barn, now fully rebuilt, Caleb stood surrounded by neighborhood children, boys and girls, gripping rusty screwdrivers and bent nails while he patiently showed them how to fix a busted water pump. He didn't smile much, but the kids did. And when they asked why the pump worked again, he only shrugged and said, because it mattered to someone. They didn't live in the shed anymore. Willer had cleared out the old guest room and made space without making it a gesture. The boys still worked daily, still refused to be idle. But something had changed. They stood straighter, spoke more, laughed, sometimes, when the world allowed, and the town. It didn't applaud, it didn't apologize either. But people began waving again. A few came by to buy eggs. Someone donated a new wheelbarrow. And slowly, the rumors dried up not because they were proven false, but because no one dared repeat them after seeing what came of them. That fall, during the Harvest Festival, Prairie Bend held its annual gathering by the community hall. Booths lined the street with baked goods, crafts, and children running wild. But the largest crowd gathered near the center stage, where Willer Langford stood once again not behind a microphone this time, but beside two boys in worn denim and flannel, faces sun-kissed from work, eyes steady as the crowd turned to them. "These aren't just helpers," Willer said, her voice clear. "They're not just workers. They're not just the boys I took in when no one else would. They're my partners, my people, sons of this land." The applause started with the mayor, then the doctor, then nearly everyone. Julian's face flushed, not with shame, but something close to peace. Caleb didn't move, but his hand rested on Julian's back. Solid, quiet, proud. A little girl tugged Willer's sleeve and pointed at them. "Are they brothers?" Willer looked down, smiled softly, and said, "Yes, and that love saved us all." The girl nodded, satisfied with the answer, because to her, to the next generation, there was no question worth arguing with the truth she saw. Julian later wrote in his journal, "We thought being gay would always be something we had to survive. But maybe it was the very thing that taught us how to rebuild what hate tried to destroy. And in a town where reputation once ruled over reason, kindness, slow, imperfect, relentless kindness had rewritten the story." Now ask yourself this. If you had seen them walk up that snowy path, no coat, no past, no place to belong, would you have opened the gate, or would you have turned away like the world already had? Tell us in the comments. We need to hear your truth. Subscribe to Heart Stories, now where stories dare to be vulnerable. Love refuses to be silenced, and the ones the world casts aside rise, because the world needs more than tolerance. It needs recognition. It needs courage. It needs you, yeah.